Colin, and I just want to say I'm excited to be here tonight. I have been involved with the Champaign County Audubon since my beginning days of birding. So that started all the way back in, I think, 2009. And Zach was one of my original, Zach Sutton, who's involved with the society, is one of my original birding buddies. Colin and I have done some birding together. I want to give a shout out to all the uni high parents. I see a lot of former friends and former classmates' parents here. So just it's great to see such a good crowd for this talk. And I have worked in a lot of different places, but tonight I'm going to be telling you about a little bit about the birds in Champaign-Urbana and some work that we've been doing. And then also some future work that hopefully, if people are interested, you can get involved in. So I just want to start out kind of talking about the importance of urban green spaces, specifically for wildlife. And so this is a burgeoning area of research. I imagine that everybody in this talk came here because they are invested in birds and in wildlife in particular, and probably you all, do some local bird watching and bird feeding in your own yards and in our community. So it's becoming increasingly realized in recent decades that urban green spaces are very important for wildlife, and in a rapidly changing world where we're losing habitat all over the place and getting increasing concentrations of people in urban centers, it's important to understand how these urban green spaces can support biodiversity. So we can kind of divide these green spaces into sort of public and private green spaces. And what I mean by that when I'm talking about public spaces, click here, there we go, is kind of like parks and natural areas. So think about parks like Meadowbrook and Urbana. There's a variety of parks in Champaign and Urbana around town, natural areas like remnant prairies or restored prairies like Meadowbrook, places like Weaver Park. But there are also private green spaces such as yards and gardens. And I'm sure that many of you here today do gardening and probably do specific gardening that is amenable to attracting birds into your yards. And the focus in recent years has shifted from the sort of importance of these public parks and natural areas, which has been pretty well established, to yards and gardens, and the increasing realization that private green spaces and residential areas can support substantial biodiversity and specifically substantial bird diversity. These private yards and gardens can support unique species assemblages. They often are varied habitat types. So in Urbana, in recent years, I've been seeing an increasing trend of these sort of remnant prairies in people's yards, which attract native birds and other native creatures as well. Some people have forested backyards. So just to it kind of hits home the heterogeneity that you can find in some of these different urban areas. And furthermore, these yards and gardens are epicenters of human-wildlife interactions. So research has shown that a lot of interactions, in fact, the majority, I think somewhere around 60 or 70% of interactions with wildlife often occur within a few miles of people's homes. So they're incredibly important spaces, not only for supporting wildlife, but also for humans to interact with wildlife and to feel connected to wildlife. And they also have important impacts on wildlife behavior. So examples of this include stuff like bird feeding. I'm just curious, and I think I can see here but I can't see many people's videos. Videos are off, but if you want to turn your video on and just raise your hand, or use the little button at the bottom to kind of raise your hand. I'm curious, how many people in here feed birds or have features in their yard that are designed to attract birds? Oh yeah, I'm seeing a lot of hands here. That's what I like to see. So bird feeding is one example of this, but it looks like almost everyone in here has kind of raised the hand or put up a little icon. And it just kind of drives home the importance of these yards for interactions with wildlife and the impacts on behavior as well. So getting into other factors that can influence bird community structure beyond the sort of public-private dichotomy are factors like, the different types of management that cities or entities within cities use to, sort of govern these natural areas and parks. And also the private decisions that people make in their own homes. So all of these things influence bird community structure. And if you take an example here, this is sort of a screenshot from Google Maps. So you can see on the bottom panel the East Urbana, and this is right by, the middle school over here. You can see that there is, you can see the fields. You can see there's tons of trees. Urbana is obviously a tree city, very friendly towards wildlife. And then we can kind of see some of these newer areas around town. And I'm not trying to disparage people who live in Northwest Champaign, so don't get offended. But there are big differences in sort of management strategies and other factors that influence things as well, including in public areas, at least, the different management practices of, for example, the park district, like the Urbana versus the Champaign Park District. Neighborhood age. So here we're looking at, a more established neighborhood in East Urbana. And then some of these areas like Northwest Champaign here, where you can see there's very sparse vegetation and tree cover, are newer neighborhoods. So they just haven't had time to really grow up and be able to have that same sort of mature tree cover. Neighborhood locations. So, people can kind of, people who have the means can choose to live in the places that they like. And, that might be places like, for example, Yankee Ridge subdivision, which is very forested and is very close to some of our premier natural areas in Champaign-Urbana, like Meadowbrook Park. Other people don't have that luxury. And the same goes for income. So, these factors are all kind of work together to influence bird community structure. And one of the aspects of the projects that I'm not going to be talking about tonight, but that we're actively working on, is trying to understand, how some of these factors like socioeconomics also influence the bird community structure around Champaign-Urbana. Just to give you a bit of a taste for the differences between Champaign and Urbana, Champaign covers a much larger geographic area with a much larger population size. Interestingly enough, the population density isn't that different, but just because of the size of Champaign alone, there's a lot more space there. Champaign actually has a lot more green space area, which might surprise you. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about public parks. So Champaign has almost 20 more parks than Urbana. And a lot of this has to do with, again, the size of these different cities. But suffice it to say that there are important differences between these two cities that we expected when we started this study would potentially influence bird diversity. In addition to these factors that I've mentioned, season is an important factor. So as we all probably know, birds behave differently and often migrate during different seasons. So in the summer, for example, the pressures that are going to be influencing birds and where they end up choosing their habitat is going to be trying to find areas that are good for breeding, areas where they can find mates. In spring and fall, migration is a critical aspect of bird life history. So, getting out of Dodge before it gets too cold and kind of moving to a more suitable area. And then, of course, in the winter, these birds have this intense selective pressure, at least in places like Illinois, where it gets quite cold in the winter, of trying to survive the cold. These are the year-round resident birds that live here throughout the year. So again, the importance of private and public green spaces may actually differ seasonally based on some of these pressures, and that's something that we're going to be looking into today. So this kind of sets up the questions that we came to this project with. And so this project, as Colin mentioned, is in collaboration with my postdoc supervisor at the university, Karina Van Riper, who's in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. And I came on this project with the goal of doing a sort of standardized bird census throughout the Champaign-Urbana community. And we had a few different questions that we were interested in based on some of these factors that I've mentioned. So the first question is trying to understand how the bird community differs across seasons. As we know, there are way fewer birds here in the winter, but how exactly does the community differ and which species are present in the summer versus the winter? Again, these data are sort of preliminary. So, we've collected 2 seasons worth of data. We've actually submitted for funding to try to expand this into other towns in the Midwest and also try to collect across the full annual cycle, because obviously, these areas are very important for migratory birds as well. But for now, we're going to be focusing primarily on birds that are breeding residents here in the summer, and then birds that are overwintering residents. The second question we want to understand, as I mentioned earlier, is how does bird community structure differ between public and private green spaces? These public spaces like public parks and natural areas versus yards and gardens. We wanted to look for potential differences between Champaign and Urbana, given the fact that the cities do differ quite a lot in their histories and their management practices, et cetera. So we expected that there would be differences in those areas as well. And lastly, we wanted to understand which green spaces around Champaign-Urbana were key areas of bird diversity. And I will mention that the ultimate goal of this project is to try to get, decent information on where birds are hanging out throughout the year, and try to disseminate this information to the park districts and to members of the community so that people are aware of, where you can find birds around town. That was one of the motivations for this study. So I'm going to just briefly talk about methods. We did point counts, which many of you may be familiar with, but for those that aren't, a point count is basically just a stationary count where you stand in one spot and you try to detect all the birds that you possibly can, sometimes within a given radius. So for example, within 50 meters, sometimes it's within any distance. And you try to detect all the birds that you can based on birds that you can see and birds that you can hear. So it's sort of a multimodal kind of sampling effort, which involves both listening and looking. We conducted point counts in the winter and summer, as I mentioned. So that was in January and February of this year, and then June and July of this year. And we conducted these at 80 green spaces distributed around Champaign-Urbana, 40 of which were public and 40 of which were private. So again, the fundamental question, or one of the fundamental questions, was trying to understand this public-private axis for the impact of that on bird community structure. These point counts were 10 minutes. So we'd go and we'd stand in the same spot for 10 minutes. We did that 5 times at each of these points. And at some of the green spaces, which were a bit larger, like Meadowbrook and other ones, we actually had multiple points per park. So we ended up having not 80, but 93 points. When you multiply that by 5 reps, that's 465 point counts in a season. And we did this in 2 seasons. So that is a lot of data. And I'll show you the numbers here in a minute, but you'll see this was a tremendous effort. And of course, I have to give a shout out to my buddies, Zach and Colin. Zach and Colin, as probably all of you know, are birders extraordinaire. Colin may be the best birder in the state of Illinois. It's up for grabs, but he's an incredible ornithologist and birder, and Zach is as well. And so when I came onto this project, I tapped these 2 guys who both are certainly better birders than me, at least in this particular area. And I wanted to put together an all-star team. And as you can see here, they're hard at work. This is actually from a trip that we took this summer to the Dominican Republic, where we did some birding this summer. So these guys came out and helped and were instrumental in collecting these data. So I just wanted to make sure that I give them a shout out. Just to introduce you to the different green spaces around town, this is a map of the different green spaces. So what you're looking at here is these sort of shaded polygons represent the sort of city limits of Champaign and Urbana. And each of those points that you're looking at there represents a private and a public point count location. So the squares are in parks or natural areas around town. You can see here kind of in the northeastern area, just outside the Urbana boundary. We also had sites in kind of remnant natural areas like Treeless and Brownfield Woods. And then we also, had some points in areas in like West Champaign that technically weren't included in the city boundary. We wanted to get a comprehensive kind of understanding of where birds were hanging out in these different areas. So that's a map of where we conducted the data. This is a quick look at the number of birds we counted. So I'm going to start getting into methods here. And so in winter, we counted almost 5,000 different, registered almost 5,000 different detections. In summer, it was almost 9,000. Interestingly, we actually counted a lot more birds in winter because there were large flocks of geese and other birds and such. But in winter, we ended up tallying about 60 species and then about 90 species in summer. So, this is not necessarily, when I say comprehensive, I don't mean this is every single species that is detected in Champaign-Urbana, not even in this year. If you look at eBird and kind of compile a list for Champaign County, you'll find more species, but I think we did a pretty darn good job of detecting everything that was around, given that, we were only sampling these points for 10 minutes at a time. So take it with a grain of salt, but this is a relatively complete picture of the Champaign-Urbana bird community. And what we're looking at here is, I'll start with the winter data. So this is just a frequency histogram. So basically just shows you which bird species are most common or most abundant in the winter. And what you can see here is that in the winter, the bird community is dominated by a handful of really common species. So the most common species that we detected, which we detected almost twice as much as any other species, were American crows. Crows are all over town, both in Champaign and Urbana. They aggregate in large numbers in the winter. And so that was the most common species. Other species that we found included the northern cardinal, house finch, blue jay, house sparrow, and European starling. So again, very, very common backyard birds that I'm sure most of us are probably all familiar with. But you can see here that we detected a lot more species as well, although most of these species were quite rare and were not very abundant in the winter. We got some really, really interesting ones, like Colin detected a fish crow in Champaign, which was very strange, detected it by vocalization. And that crow's actually been hanging around town for the last couple of years. On and off. It's been cited here a couple times. Zach detected a bald eagle. I'm not going to get into all the species, but suffice it to say, if you're interested in kind of looking at this or staring at it to kind of take it all in with more time to digest the information, I'd be happy to share the information. So you can just send me an email. I'll have my email at the end of the talk. In the summer, we found that there were more species, as to be expected. So obviously, pretty trivial result, but it's more diverse in the summer. There are more species breeding here than overwintering here. And we saw some of the same kind of cast of characters, as well as a few different ones. So the most common bird that we detected in the summer was American robin. They are ubiquitous around town and ubiquitous in everyone's yards. Northern cardinals, again, and American crows were second and third. Brown-headed cowbirds, which are brood parasites and migratory, came in fourth. House wren, and then, house sparrow and other species. We also detected over here on the right, though, and again, I'm not going to get into any of the into all of the species, but we detected some really rare and surprising species within the city limits, including Bell's vireo, Eurasian collared dove, a few different Kentucky warblers. So, pretty interesting and kind of cool to see, how these relatively small Midwestern towns are supporting bird diversity. And then there was also two detections of the state endangered listed black crowned night heron, which we got at a couple of different places in Champaign. So that was pretty exciting as well. So now I'm going to get into kind of the summary results. And one of the big things we found, which we expected, but we actually found a surprising result, so this varied depending on season, is we found that public spaces support more bird diversity. So those public parks and natural areas support more birds, but only in the summer. So what we're looking at here on the y-axis is species richness. This is just a simple metric of diversity. I will say that we found similar results for a variety of different types of diversity metrics, but for simplicity's sake, I'll only be talking about the number of species in these different types of areas. And you can see the red represents private areas, so that's people's yards. The blue represents public areas, so that's public parks and natural areas. And what we can see here is that in the winter, private green spaces actually supported equivalent bird diversity to public green spaces. So the letters above those different box plots represent whether they're different from each other. And what you can see here is that public and private areas in the winter are actually quite similar to each other. And that was surprising. We were surprised by that because we expected that these public areas would just, have, more diversity, more heterogeneity. And so we expected they would be better. And we indeed did find that in the summer. So you can see those letters B and C. You can see that public areas had way more bird diversity in the summer, but not in the winter. So this was kind of a cool and surprising result. Why is this? You might be asking yourself. Well, I have a couple different suspicions. I think that it could have to do with bird feeding. So I think that in the winter, when it's really cold, and there is some evidence from other studies that suggest this may be the case, I think there might be an influx of birds from these kind of more open natural areas into the more sheltered urban areas where there can be a heat island effect, so it can be a little bit warmer than it is in the more open areas, and also because of bird feeding. So bird feeding is at its core sort of a huge natural experiment of people, artificially supplementing food for birds. And it was interesting to see how that influenced their diversity in the winter, at least. Additionally, we also found big differences between Champaign and Urbana. So this was what we expected, but it was pretty crazy to see the differences. So what we're looking at here is Champaign on the left and Urbana on the right, and you can see the same metric. So just the number of species or species richness on the y-axis. And you can see here across seasons, we're seeing the same pattern. So in both Champaign and Urbana, within a given city, there were more birds in the summer, which is sort of a trivial result. But the important takeaway here is when you compare Champaign to Urbana or compare across the cities, you can see that Urbana has much higher diversity, and that's particularly pronounced in the summer. So Urbana is just supporting more bird species, and we'll get into the reasons for that here in a minute. So I kind of want to take a look, and this is a lot of information to digest, but I'll kind of walk you through these tables. So what we're looking at in these tables is we're looking at different public green spaces. So these are parks in Champaign. And you can see the different number of species detected in the winter and summer in the middle columns. And then when I say rare species detected, what I mean by when I'm invoking the term rare species is just, it's sort of an arbitrary cutoff, but these are species of which were detected 5 or fewer times throughout our entire survey. So again, we surveyed 465. We did 93 points. We had 465 point count. So species that were detected 5 or fewer times were considered rare. And you can see here that in Champaign, a lot of these parks do not support a lot of diversity. So kind of Noel Park, Centennial, Westside, Weisgarver, they don't have many rare species, and they also have, kind of low overall species richness. There were some surprises in there. So places like Dodds Park was kind of surprising. Heritage Park, I would argue, is one of the better parks in Champaign. There's a large body of water there and some restored prairie. And so again, we detected the state endangered black-crowned night heron. You get green heron and wood duck there. And in the winter, you get belted kingfisher. And it was the only place we detected belted kingfisher in the winter. Robeson Park as well has water. And in the summer, we detected probably a late migrating least flycatcher. And also it was the only other place where we detected belted kingfisher. And there's a few other interesting ones scattered throughout Champaign. So Kaufman Lake is another one where there's not very high diversity, but you can see that there were, black-crowned night heron in the summer. In the winter, we got a blue-winged teal and a lot of snow goose, and that's the only place in town where we found those species. So, I don't want to talk badly about Champaign. Champaign has its unique properties and unique green spaces, but when you take a look at Urbana here, you can see clear differences. And so what we're looking at here are some of the major public green spaces in Urbana. And you see here that far and away, Meadowbrook Park dominates both in terms of winter and summer species richness, and having the highest species richness in both seasons. In addition, what you'll notice here, if you look at that last column, is you'll notice that there are a lot more rare species detected in the Urbana Park. So the ecologically specialized species that are not very abundant around town, and that really are the things that birders go for, are pretty much only present in these premier parks in Urbana. When I say premier parks, the 3 ones that I'm talking about are Meadowbrook Park, Busey Woods / Crystal Lake, where we kind of merge those together, and then Weaver Park. And as we'll discuss here in a bit, a lot of this has to do with the different management practices of these 3 different parks. When you look at other parks around town, you'll notice that, there are a scattering of, kind of rare species and higher diversity in the Champaign parks. But in particular, these 3 parks have a lot of unique species. So you can kind of stare at that. Meadowbrook Park, one of the only places we detected hairy woodpecker, orchard oriole, grosbeaks, pheasants, cuckoo, yellowbug cuckoo, red-shouldered hawk, all of these different species that we detected, and especially in the summer. Crystal Lake was one of the only places in town where you get yellow-throated warbler. Northern parrots are very common at Crystal Lake and not very common in other places. Acadian flycatcher are pretty much only in Busey Woods in the Crystal Lake area. So again, you're seeing that these premier parks in Urbana are doing their job as we might expect, but it's really cool to be able to actually put hard numbers on this and show how the bird communities are varying across these different parks. The next thing I'm going to get into here is trying to understand kind of from a more nuanced perspective how these communities differ. And I'm not going to get into all the complicated methods. This graph might be really confusing, but what I want you to focus on here is I want you to focus on basically the different colors. So I'm colorblind, and a collaborator made this graph, so I may butcher this, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me, but I think that the orange represents public land. So in Champaign and Urbana, that's sort of the orange circle. And then the private land is represented by the dark blue circle. Did I get those right? Someone give me a thumbs up. I think I got that right. Anyways, you guys probably get the idea. The orange circles are public land and the blue circles are private. And what you see here is that in the summer in particular, that blue circle is nested fully inside of that orange circle. And what that means is that private areas are a subset of, in terms of the birds that are found in public areas. In fact, every bird that was found in these premier public parks was also found in private areas. So it just shows you that private areas are supporting a fraction of the bird diversity that these public areas are in the summer in particular. But what you'll notice when you look at the second panel is you'll notice that there's separation between these two kind of ovals. And so what that means from a biological perspective is it means that there are differences in the bird communities in winter. So in winter, the number of species in private and public green spaces is actually pretty similar, but there are different species that are present in each of those different types of habitats. And so that is really interesting because what it suggests is that the selective pressures that are associated with private yards, like bird feeding and other things, like, you know, other features that are made to be wildlife friendly and bird friendly, are actually having a really strong impact in the winter. And again, we don't have the specific information, but we did test some hypotheses. So you can see those boxes that say temperature and development and forest. And what we found is that in both seasons, the amount of vegetation and forest cover was actually significantly higher in Urbana, and the amount of development and temperature, the amount of development in Champaign was significantly higher. So it's a more developed city. And then temperatures were different as well. So temperature was higher in Champaign in the summer and lower in Champaign in the winter compared to Urbana. So again, these are kind of inklings into some of the mechanisms that may be underlying these differences between private and public areas across seasons. Now, this is another really busy graph, but what I want you to focus on here, so again, these are all of the different sites that we sampled across in a given season. So here we're looking only at winter data, and we're looking at all of the 80 different sites that we sampled. And the squares represent Champaign, and the circles represent Urbana, and the open ones represent private areas, and the closed ones represent public areas. So just take a minute to kind of stare at that. And what you'll see here is if you look at over here on the right side of the graph where you have the highest species richness, you can see that pretty much the first 15 sites here are all located in Urbana. Some of those are private and some are public. So again, in the winter, private sites are serving really important roles for supporting birds. But again, all in Urbana. So what it shows you is that Urbana just far and away is supporting a more diverse bird community than Champaign. And if we look at that same pattern in the summer, we see a slightly different pattern. Let me actually go back here so you can kind of, if you can see on the x-axis down here in the bottom, the top sites in town in winter were the forestry, which is directly across from Meadowbrook Park. That's a University of Illinois property. Meadowbrook Park, which is number 2, and then actually a private residence, Persimmon Court, which is located in the Yankee Ridge subdivision. So all 3 of those areas, and again, it's consistent and shows that our data are pretty accurate, but all 3 of those areas are right next to each other, and they all had the highest species richness. If you look at the next highest areas, Crystal Lake, UC is not far behind, and then you have Weaver right behind that. And then a couple other neighborhoods around town. But in general, again, these premier areas of UC, Weaver and Meadowbrook are performing head and shoulders above the rest in terms of how they support bird diversity. If we look here in the summer, we see that, again, if you look at sort of the top 10 most diverse places, what you'll see is that all of those are filled in shapes here. So whether there was one in Champaign, again, most of them were in Urbana. But again, it shows you that in the summer, public green spaces are outperforming private green spaces or people's yards in terms of how many birds they're supporting. But you also see similar patterns in terms of the spaces that are most important. So again, this outlier up here that's just way higher than anything else is Meadowbrook. Right behind that, you have Crystal Lake Park. Surprisingly, in third is Dodds Park, which includes the Parkland campus, but we sampled at a couple natural areas in the Parkland campus, so that's kind of why that is. And then you have Weaver Park right behind it, and then you have 2 other university areas of Brownfield and Treelease Woods kind of rounding out the top 5 or 6 places. So again, what we see here is that in general, Urbana is doing a better job at supporting birds in Champaign, but you also see that particularly in the summer, these public green spaces are supporting a lot more bird diversity. So to conclude, what we've shown here, and we'll kind of rehash the questions that I posed to you at the beginning. How does the bird community differ across seasons? Well, not surprisingly, we found there's a lot higher diversity in summer, and this is true in both Champaign and Urbana. But in terms of public and private green spaces, it's a more nuanced story. And we found that in the winter, private yards do almost as good a job of supporting bird diversity as public spaces, and they have distinct birds in those areas. So that is really shows you that it's really important. The decisions that you all make in your yards is really important for birds in town. So you got to keep doing what you're doing, especially those of you who are living in Urbana, where we see so many more species in both seasons. We also see that in the summer, there's nothing that can replace these public signature green spaces. So it reinforces the importance of places like Meadowbrook Park, Weaver Park, UC as sort of reservoirs of diversity in the urban landscape. Lastly, Urbana has much higher diversity and probably most importantly, a lot more ecologically rare species than Champaign. And then finally, in terms of which green spaces are key areas for biodiversity, as I mentioned, the signature UPD parks and also the UIUC remnant natural areas, a lot of which are, for example, remnants of the big grove forests that used to be here, like tree lease and brownfield, are also really important for supporting those unique species and higher species richness. So what are the implications of this? Well, there's a couple that I want to go through really quickly. And the first is that management matters. And we see big differences between Urbana and Champaign Park District parks. And a lot of this has to do with the different audiences or you know, the different foci of these two different organizations. In Champaign, a lot of the parks are focused towards creating family parks. They're focused towards, you know, trying to have multi-use parks. Whereas in Urbana, we have these really unique places like Meadowbrook that are, you know, restored native habitats that are just incomparable for supporting diversity. So, you know, the management strategies of the Urbana Park District are clearly working, and they need to keep doing what they're doing, because that's why we have such a great bird community in town, or at least part of the reason. The other thing in relation to that is that restoration works. So again, Meadowbrook and Weaver, both of which are kind of restored areas, and these habitats that, you know, used to be kind of the mode or the most common habitat in Illinois that were destroyed with, you know, human settlement and urbanization. You know, those areas, even if they're restored areas, are still really important for these unique bird assemblages. And the same goes for those remnant natural areas like that used to be part of the Big Grove, for example, like UC tree lease and brownfield woods. Lastly, I think the most important takeaway, again, as I mentioned, is that especially in winter, the decisions that you make as homeowners and as stewards of the environment are having an impact. So, you know, both public and private decision making are clearly important for influencing and supporting a diverse bird community. I really quickly want to mention future directions and give a plug for some of my collaborators. So one thing that we're doing that I would love for all of you to get involved in, and I'll put my email at the end of this talk, and I'll also send Colin a copy of this talk in case you want to look through it a little bit more and get in touch with me. But we are trying to reach out to local residents, and we're trying to do a big survey of Champaign-Urbana to understand people's preferences for birds. So where do people interact with birds? What traits do they find attractive that make them want to, you know, support birds and conserve birds? You know, which natural areas do you all view as important in your own mind for birds? And then lastly, we're doing some really cool collaborations with the Urbana Park District to try to understand how bird outreach and hands-on, you know, sort of outreach like mist netting. And this is something that Roger was privy to this summer. He came by and checked it out. But how does this outreach actually impact children's natural values and pro-environmental behavior? So we're combining this ecological data with social science data, doing surveys of children to try to do a pre and post to understand how these experiences actually influence the kids and get them more connected to nature. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. This is a picture of Zach and Colin on our summer trip to the Dominican Republic. Had to give them another shout out for all of the help. Could not have done this without them. And again, I would really love to hear from you. So please reach out at my email, which is listed right here. And let me know if you are interested in getting involved in this survey, which we'll probably be administering sometime in January or February.
All right. Thank you so much, Henry, for that amazing talk. And I'll open it up to the floor for anyone to have any questions.
Am I supposed to call on people or?
I don't know what the best option would be. I guess maybe, how about if anyone wants to question, just raise your hand and then I'll just, or go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead, man.
Yeah, Henry, how did you handle the potential for biases being introduced